All right, here's the second example in section 2. Now, this one should go a little faster now that you know what changing the input means versus changing the entire function. So here you're going to make some transformations that are reflections in both the x and y axis. So let's go back to your journal, and this on page 10, it tells us exactly how to make reflections in the x and y axis. So this one's pretty basic. All you're doing is you are applying some negative signs to the output and to the input. So let's look at what different changes cause a reflection in the x and to the y. So here's a reflection in the x-axis, which means our function flips over the x-axis. So it means we're taking our function and just flipping it. It's like a mirror. We're just flipping it over the x-axis. So if we make our entire function negative, we're going to flip over the x-axis. For the y-axis, if we just make our input negative, we're going to flip over the y-axis. Okay, so simple. X-axis reflection, you make the entire function negative. Y-axis reflection, you make just the input negative. So since you know what that means, the difference between input and output changes, let's go ahead and look at this. So the first one, we want to write a new function g whose graph has a y or an x-axis reflection. So just as a reminder, x-axis reflection just means making our whole function negative. So again, let's go ahead, and what we want to do means we're changing the sign of the entire function. So what that means, here we go, we're going to write this with our whole function in there. We're not going to write any numbers yet. So we're going to make this entire function negative. Now, what's really helpful here is before you start applying signs to everything, let's just take this statement right here and just replace f of x with your entire function. Now put it in parentheses because we don't want to apply this negative yet. So we're going to go ahead, and we know we're making this entire function negative. Now when we distribute this negative, remember, a negative, it doesn't go to every term inside the absolute value. You think of this absolute value bars as one whole term. So when we distribute this, it just makes our first term negative and our second term negative because we distribute this negative to both terms. So our function ends up being negative absolute value of x plus 3 minus 1. Again, we just distributed this negative to the entire function. So that's an x-axis reflection. We took our entire function and made it negative. Now, let's look at a y-axis reflection. Again, let's look at our rules right here. We want to just make our input negative. So remember, if we look back at our other example, that means we're just going to take the x values in our function and make them negative. So let's look at how we do that. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to write out our function and take f of negative x. What that means is wherever we have an x in our function, we're going to make it negative. So we just replace x with negative x. Again, that's the difference between making your entire function negative versus making the input negative. So we've got negative x plus 3 plus 1. Now you just take this function with the new input and you go ahead and you simplify it. And here we go. If we want to simplify this a little more. Now, this isn't always necessary. Right now you could leave it at negative x plus 3 or switch it around to 3 minus x. But for math formatting, this is the way you should go because you always want to have positive values inside your absolute value sign. You always want to have your x start with a positive value. So I will go over this a little bit more in class, but technically you should have only positive x values in your absolute value. So for right now, if you left it as negative x plus 3 or 3 minus x, that would be acceptable. moving forward, we do want to talk about this rule, and the way you would leave it is you could take out this -1 and it becomes x minus 3. Again, that's the product property of absolute value. We'll go over that a little bit more. But for right now, you just want to make sure you get this negative value inserted for x. So we'll talk about that in more detail. What I want you guys to do right now is go ahead and complete these two problems, and then go ahead and write your answers in the text box that comes up.